Professor Belko has been thinking about, talking about, and planning this day for months. And here we are, and we couldn't be happier to have a full room, and I couldn't be happier to see some of my own students here to support Dr. Belko, this effort, and our guests. Drew, as Dr. Belko said, I've been on the board of TDS for more than 10 years, so I really know that organization well. But I'm fascinated to learn more about the motivation for the founding of your own organization. And as many of our students are thinking about law school in the future and what I'm going to be, I know that who you were as a UH Law Center student, the time afterwards, and then deciding to launch something impactful happened in phases. Mm-hmm. So welcome, and please share with our students. Please begin. That's a pretty open-ended question, but talk a little bit about the inspiration for the work you do and a little bit about the work that you do.
Thanks. Yeah, it's an honor to be sitting here with people from TDS. When I was at Texas Innocence Network, which is here at U of H, doing death penalty work, I went to law school for tax law, so I don't know, I liked numbers. And did an internship at Texas Innocence Network and just had no idea anything about the system. My background is very middle class. I'm from Arlington, Texas. Everything you would assume about a place that was once ranked, on the top list of most hillbilly cities in America. And so I didn't know much about the criminal justice system. And so when I did this internship on a death penalty and I saw a Black man who was mentally ill, who was very poor in Beaumont, Texas, and how he had been treated his entire life, who was faced being murdered by the state of Texas, really did a lot of proactive investigation, even to some of my supervisor's behest at the time, of really figuring out that I believe this man to be innocent. Not only that, he was a truly redeemed man, was saving people while he was on death row. And what he told me was this frustration of, hey, every attorney I've ever had has been trying to prove that I am mentally insane, and my entire life I've been trying to prove that I am sane. Really spoke to the dehumanization that our system constantly does. Had he lived another 2 years, the ruling in the Supreme Court of certain IQ and Texas's version of what is mentally ill could not be used. So he would be alive today. So he was wrongfully murdered by the state of Texas on a number of reasons. I believe because of innocence, because of who he was as a human, and because of the law as it's written now. So that moment changed me very profoundly to become a public defender. And so that's kind of the start of the discussion about the organization is public defense. And so luckily here we are in March, and y'all may not know it, but it is, at RJ at least, it is Public Defense Month, because on March 18th, 1963, the Supreme Court ruled Gideon v. Wainwright, which enshrined the right to counsel for everyone, regardless of income level. And that's what created the public defender system, and America has been, so about that time, you have the right to public defense. And that's when the civil rights movement was really making a lot of strides. The status quo response was to build up mass incarceration, the new Jim Crow, right? And so as you can look at it on a chart, as mass incarceration rises, you have this new right to public defense that could never catch up. And so we have never honored, what Gideon v. Wainwright called for, and that's a real tragedy, and the disparity has only gotten worse. And so one big way that happened was overloaded inadequate attorneys. Is they're given way too many cases, and they forget about clients for a year sometimes in jail. And so that's what we do, is we step in whenever there's an overloaded court-appointed attorney who's forgetting someone in jail. We will step in and then turn that around and provide holistic and client-centered representation that has become pretty innovative because of the pieces Monique has brought to us. So, sorry, I know that was long.
No,
I'm a lawyer. So.
So you step in and you offer services, both of you do, that are beyond the scope of just simply representing them. And you're also inspired by faith.
Yes, yeah. I mean, there's a couple angles on faith. I mean, personally, that's what got me to it. since you mentioned it. Actually, the day that Marvin Wilson was the initial death penalty client with Texas Innocence Network, he was being executed, and Texas does executions at sundown, just to be super creepy about it. I don't know. But I was sitting in a Bible study. I had fasted that day with my faith and had heard a Bible verse, Proverbs 31, 8 and 9, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, defend the rights of the poor and needy. So that moment was my personal faith driven. But I mean, as we kind of get into the work and the nitty gritty over the years, there's a real serious component. And you look at that timeline, right? And there's all kinds of places on recidivism, faith incorporated, all that. And are they innocent? Do we need to worry about the end game? All that kind of stuff. But there's real statistics all along the timeline that if someone does engage in their faith, it doesn't matter which faith, just a faith of a higher being, it gives them a level of hope and a level of belief in humanity can come back around that really helps them be seen as human. And so we kind of recognize that from a scientific perspective as well, that, hey, this is going to benefit our clients regardless of, we're not doing any kind of like Bible reading or anything in any means, just it's going to be beneficial to the system, it's going to be beneficial to our clients, and so why not lean in?
So before we turn to Burke and the work that TDS does, talk about where you come in the flow chart and how many clients are you able to serve?
Yeah, so there's, this timeline, we've got our own, and there's all kinds of spectrums, and anybody can spend a whole career on any level, from all the way of analyzing police and their patrol and search, policy, all the way to post-conviction, ban the box type, are we going to let collateral consequences? We are kind of in the smack dab middle of after someone has been arrested, then they get appointed an attorney. And so that trial work, not post-conviction work, is where we really step in. I always kind of tell the reentry groups, because there's a lot more of those, if y'all are reentry, we're pre-entry. So we really prevent the prison. And we have found that for every client, we can save an average of 5 years of incarceration for every client. To answer your question of how many, it depends on which year and which funding level we're at.
But to take a step back, you represent someone after they've been at the trial level, after they have first been arrested?
Yes, they've been arrested, so they're accused, so they are presumed innocent. We try to prioritize people that are detained pre-trial, often because of, cash bail policies.
So you're there at the very beginning. One last thing, there was a story in the Chronicle about a Harris County lawyer who had been paid $1 million because she had something like 200 or more clients.
200 misdemeanors plus like 400 felonies. Yeah.
So it speaks to our system
Mm-hmm.
and to the inequities in representation. And so you have a more holistic approach that goes beyond just your trial representation.
Yeah, I mean, our perspective is we step in for those folks that are getting the absolute worst from the system because they deserve the absolute best. And that's the only way we're really going to change it, one client and heart at a time.
Burke, they start at the front end, and we at TDS, we come along a little bit later in the process.
A little bit later in the process.
Talk about the work that we do.
Texas Defender Service was founded in 1995. And for most of our over 27-year history, we have fought to stop new executions and death sentences. Last month, we just saved 3 new lives, so that makes, since 2018, 35 individuals. Since then, we've saved some executions and death sentences in the state of Texas, and we've recently expanded our mission to serve people who are serving other extreme sentences in the state of Texas. And when I was thinking about coming here today and speaking with you, I was thinking about the topic of this entire series, which is so important in our nation's history right now, which is equity and pathways to equity across many different spheres and today in our criminal legal system. And so I was trying to think in my mind, what does equity look like in our criminal legal system? And I can start by telling you that the system we have today is a system that disinvests in human potential, in families, in humanity, in children, in parents. Inequity looks like the fact that the rate of incarceration of women in the state of Texas has risen by 800% since 1980. The vast majority of those women had incomes of less than $10,000 a year before they were incarcerated, and most of them are mothers. Inequity looks like Andre Thomas, who is scheduled for execution in April. He's a Black man who was tried before an all-white jury, 25% of whom expressly espoused racist views in the juror questionnaires they filled out before trial. Although he is schizophrenic, and although he has gouged out both of his own eyes and is blind, the state of Texas plans to execute him anyway. Inequity looks like our client Michael, who was sentenced for a crime he did not commit when he was 20 years old. He was a gay man who had been assaulted as a child. His church had sent him to a training camp to teach him how to not be gay. He was so traumatized by his own life experiences that he fell into drugs, and he was standing in the streets one day when another homeless person killed her abuser. That woman received a term of years. He was sentenced to life in prison, and unless we're able to get him out, he will die there. This is a system that does not prioritize public safety. It doesn't prioritize humanity. It doesn't make our communities safer. We need a system that upholds second chances, that centers healing, that centers reuniting families. 80% of people who are incarcerated in Texas prisons today have children who are under the age of 18. And the parole board denies most of the applications it receives each year, even though the vast majority of those people can easily and safely go home. They've aged out of crime. They can be reunited with the people that they love. One thing I want to tell you about the death penalty that I think is important to know is that, especially here in the South, is that the death penalty is a direct descendant of our nation's history of lynchings. 8 in 10 lynchings happened in the South. Today, 8 in 10 executions happened in the South. We have a client who was just released from death row recently after a long fight. And before his trial, a local newspaper published a letter saying that he should be lynched. You would be surprised how common this is with our clients. And the death penalty actually arose as a way to stop lynchings from happening in the streets. Instead, they just started happening in our carceral system. 90% of the people who were executed for the crime of rape in the first half of the 20th century were Black. And people who kill white people are 17 times more likely to receive the death penalty than people who kill people of color. Black people are 13% of our population, but over 40% of those who are on our death rows in the United States. And in Harris County, where we are today, 21 of the last 22 people sentenced to death were people of color. I've spoken a lot about what inequity looks like in our system today. And so, I'm sure this brings us to the broader question of what is a pathway to equity, because that's the title of this series that is here today. And there are, that's a question that requires a lot of deep thinking from people other than me. But I will say that a starting place is that we, as a society, invest in people and communities. Everyone in this room and everyone you will ever meet shares a commitment to safety and reducing violence in our communities. We all share that. But our criminal justice system today is not advancing that goal. And there are solutions that are community-based that do reduce violence in our communities, solutions like community violence interrupters, like programs that actually go into hospitals and serve people who are victims of trauma to break the cycles of violence. these are programs that we could really be focusing on rather than the system we have.
Monique, we've heard from two lawyers, and obviously the work can't be done without them, but the work can't be done well without you. So please talk a little bit about the work that you do and your own passion for this subject.
Whew, man, that was really heavy, but I appreciate you and the work you do. I just want to acknowledge that. My name is Monique Joseph. I'm the Holistic Service Director, as mentioned. I started off actually doing phlebotomy. I worked at Houston Methodist Hospital for 5 years and drew blood. And I have 3 beautiful children with my husband, David, who's from Chicago. We met in Chicago. And one day, he got accused of a crime. We went to court, and I said, hey, we'll fight it in court. You just fight it, and you'll be good. You know, it's not a big deal. I didn't know all the numbers and the data that I now know. We went before a judge, and she sentenced him to 45 years in prison. And again, we have 3 children. I started doing local advocacy with TOP and TAJ, all these orgs in Houston.
How long ago was this?
This was in 2016. Yeah, so about 5-6 years ago now. And as I started organizing in the community, I learned the statistic that, I learned the fact that Texas uses 3rd grade reading levels to predict beds in prisons. And at that time, one of my children was in 3rd grade and he was struggling with reading. And I refused to say, baby, that's just the way it is. The system's this way. Daddy's not here because the system screwed up. I told myself I would tell my children I did everything I could to prevent it. And so after volunteering for a while, I met Drew Willey, actually in Commissioner's Court one day trying to advocate for police accountability or something. And I showed him the documents from court, and we kind of just started working together on how to get some help. Eventually that led to a position at Restoring Justice as a client advocate. So I would work with the attorneys, with the folks who are experiencing the legal system, helping them get resources, IDs, jobs, whatever it may be. And then that eventually led to the Holistic Services Director position. This work is important to me because, as you mentioned, there's pathways out, right? And we often tell ourselves, like, there's these big guys, like coming in here today, I'm like, it feels kind of overwhelming because who am I to tell you anything? I'm sitting over here with attorneys, like, it doesn't, but the bigger picture here is that things can change in a split second if we decided it would. So it's not somebody outside of this room, it's not folks somewhere else, it's us. We just have to open our minds and imagine a system that addresses safety and addresses these issues in a whole different way. And it's being done. It's being done all over the world. It's been done by our ancestors in this land and across the ocean. We've done it. It's just that we just have to reimagine it. So,
Talk more specifically, though, about what is the role of that you do in client services with your clients, and that distinguishes your organization from others.
you're right. It really does. I think it's the main thing Drew and I always talk about is it's relational over clinical. So we don't go into it as, hey, I'm just trying to check some boxes, see, like, can we get you housing, can we get you a job? It is more of an investment in this relationship with our clients. And so that looks like giving us an opportunity to go before the court and say, hey, so-and-so has this many kids and this many obligations. While the judge may just see a charge, we get to actually see the children's response to their parents and the response when the parent is taken out of the household. And so it gives us an opportunity to humanize them in the court. So we do that through mitigation packets. We've had healing circles with clients where they come in and sit in a circle with their community, or if they don't have that community, Drew and I, our team, we get together in those circles and we just try and hash out all the harm that's been caused to help folks try to get to a place where they can start moving forward and not hold on to that harm.
Really, really impactful, and you similarly know, Bert, that the work that the team does in the difference that makes in trying to show the many dimensions of the clients that you serve. The challenge that you have is that they've already gotten to a point where they're really further down, further across this chart, further down and into the process.
Absolutely. So we, half of our organization are mitigation specialists who go into the field and interview our clients' families and really work in partnership with our clients and their communities to tell their stories. And then they bring those stories to the prosecutor who's seeking a death sentence and try to stop the sentence from happening. But I think these stories show why intervention at all levels of the system is so important, because so often when we're coming into a case, so much harm has already happened. And that's why you need advocacy and work at the pretrial level as well.
So Drew, you had a vision of attacking this. And I hope that our students heard, to me, one of the most important things that you said was, I wanted to be a tax lawyer. Because our students think, I've got to pick the thing that I'm going to be, and my law students think, okay, what kind of lawyer am I going to be? And I say, well, wait till you get there and see what you experience, see what you see. But you have this vision of doing something holistic, something driven by your own personal faith, driven by a personal experience. But I know how daunting it is to get up and do this every day, really against tough odds for all three of you. So you had this vision, you found it in 2016, now you're a little bit further down the road, you've had some clients. How do you keep yourself from being discouraged? Or the flip side, what encourages you to see and understand the impact that the organization is having?
Yeah, I appreciate that question a lot because I think I can answer both. What encourages me was just something I did from the very beginning, which is hopefully very honoring of the title Pathways to Equity as well, which is it's a grassroots, community-led, built organization. So I think the only thing I did really well was admit that I don't know very much. And so really bringing in directly impacted individuals to speak to what our services needed. Our very first client is now on our board. They speak to what our services were building. What do they need, right? And so we've been very agile on that, on building. That's why we had Resource Connection. That's why we are the only public defender service in the country that provides trauma-informed counseling, because trauma is really the brokenness that anyone is claiming to try to fix. It's why the volunteer, the familial support, it's how we built our services was really an equitable piece. So that's what encourages me, to answer the discouragement is a recognition of the added difficulty of that level innovation. Because when you bring people who are impacted, and I was Googling statistics on if you have a loved one who's incarcerated, your life expectancy goes down. And I was Googling that because I felt it, because we have these relationships, and I was telling my wife, I have 5 family members right now in jail that I have control over. That trauma and that emotional harm is literally taking years off of my life, and recognizing that even more so for the people who have, the most honorable I can imagine stepping in to want to do this work when it impacts you so much, right? It'd be much easier to say, let me stay as far away from that as possible. And we have clients that the moment we bail them out, they say, let me go right back in to save more people with y'all. And empowering them to do that, it is a little bit discouraging because the system, it never stops, and the incarceration never stops. And the way that we battle that is really holding ourselves accountable to self-care. And so I'm super proud of the fact that Monique, this is the one work event she's doing in a month right now because she's on a month sabbatical. And it's the first time every Restoring Justice employee, if they make it 3 years, because 3 years is a big sign of burnout, we give a month paid sabbatical. And that's just one of the things. We try to pay for counseling for staff and all those. So we really, we're even in the office all the time, do you have your counselor? Do you have your counselor? We're no. And we're kind of drowning, but we really just build each other up on that self-care piece. And that's all we know how to do. I can't say we're doing it perfectly, but we're trying.
Burke, I know we confront the same issue, but Monique, you are balancing your personal, being a single mother, keeping your family together, and then nurturing and meeting the needs of other people. I'm sure there must be some solace that comes from it, but it sounds like it must be hard.
Yeah, it's extremely hard because I'm still in communication with my husband, and he's still building a relationship with his children as they grow. They're understanding differently the system, and then at the same time, you know, so in my household, I'll see my child have like daddy and donut day, and they know daddy can't come, but they, you know, I see the emotional effects of it later on in the day. And then on top of that, I get to see, like you said, the clients and their children that I've grown connections to also suffer. And it's extremely draining. And one thing that I continually say and encourage clients and other folks in our community with is the fact that the only reason my black skin is here is because the black people before me and my family survived so much worse. How dare I not survive this? How dare I not fight? And so that is what encourages me every day, because there are folks that could be in my seat that didn't make it because, you know, they were victims and they couldn't do anything. It's gone, it's over. But for me, that is my motivation, that I made it this far because of my grandmother and grandfather. So I'll continue. If they did it in the field, they did it during Jim Crow, lynching, seeing that and still made it, I can make it. I will make it.
Absolutely. Students in, how do you confront with your own team the same challenges of engagement, of triumph? I know that we have, and our students know, that we have had some incredibly daunting cases with awful fact patterns where they're not Superman trying to save someone who's not guilty. Our clients are guilty. And the question is, what is the measure of justice? And we know members of your team who have gone to small towns and lived there for 2 months during a trial of someone who committed a heinous crime, pushing a boulder up a hill, and then having the client be sentenced.
Yeah. You know, I think the things that Restoring Justice is doing, thinking about vicarious trauma and how organizations that work in this space manage that is really wise. And those are things that, you know, we work on and think on about too, in terms of how we support our staff who are engaging in this work. And, you know, also recognizing that the work impacts people differently, even within our organization, based on their own backgrounds, based on race, based on trauma that they've experienced in their life. And so people actually have different levels of trauma. Some people are directly impacted in our organization. And so for everyone, the trauma is different, and some people carry a heavier burden of it in our group. You know, but for me personally, at the end of the day, you know, it's a real honor and a gift to be able to walk with our clients and our families and serve them. And they are the ones that are receiving the trauma. And we are there to be of service to them on the path that they're walking, whatever happens. And for all of us, that's very fulfilling.
Thank you. So now, to all of you, we want to continue the conversation, but we want to hear what you're thinking and how you're reacting. So please, some questions, please. And you know it'd be so easy for me to call on my Danny or my Simone, so I hate to do that, but Simone and Danny, why don't you start us off?
I would say perhaps one of the rebuttals that people say whenever they hear about mass incarceration and the criminal justice system being unfair, they would say, oh, well, they shouldn't have done the crime in the first place and they wouldn't be there. So what would y'all's response be to someone who says that?
And for one quick moment before they begin, you both looked at cases of clients of TDS, so just a quick note about who you looked at and how that impacted you.
Yeah, so for my research with TDS, I looked at Willey Garcia, who was convicted in the 90s for raping and raping a woman and killing her 7-year-old son. So I looked at his case, transcripts, all of that, and for me, I couldn't have a sense of him being innocent or anything like that, so he was guilty. But looking at the case, there were signs of judicial misconduct, of maybe a little bit of racism on the prosecution side. And even through that, even though I personally felt like he could have been guilty and was most likely guilty, there was still a sense of eeriness and kind of a distasteful taste in my mouth about our criminal justice system. And so that's why I asked that question, because you could look at a case of another person and think, okay, yeah, they did it, but they don't necessarily deserve the trial that they had. But someone else would say, oh well, they're guilty, so it doesn't really matter.
I mean, to me, the response is like the ultimate answer, and for us, our name is Restoring Justice, and so obviously it's kind of like, what are we restoring justice to? And even when that happens, when someone is guilty, crime is brokenness, and so a brokenness has occurred, and so let's heal that brokenness, and that's why the healing circles are so important to restorative justice practices, that each person involved can be made whole. That victim can be made whole, the defendant can be made whole, whether they did it or didn't. The witnesses in the community can be made whole, and the system actors can be made whole. It just takes a lot harder, more individualized work to do that and figure out how to do it. And that's why our current system as it is, being punitive, is never going to do that. And we start on honoring defendants' rights, because you got to do that first to then be able to equalize it, because the system is failing for victims just as much. I mean, the prosecutors are not honoring what is going to make those victims whole again, and we're really proposing let's do that so we can just figure out where wholeness can be created again.
Yeah, I was gonna say that, in society we often try other folks, right? Like they're them and I'm me. And I remember hearing recently a lady in a some type of a news network thing. She said that there's only two type of people. There's everybody does wrong basically, but there's only some of us that get caught. And I think that the folks who make that comment, what they don't realize is that it's not a victim and defendant, or like we try and not use that language at Restoring Justice, because it's a cycle, it's a circle. It's not you just start one day, committing heinous crimes. There is something that has led folks there, but we don't take time out to figure out those things and to try and address them. And I think it's easier, right, to just be like, oh yeah, just lock them up. And it's fine, but what folks don't understand is how much harm that is creating, not just for that one person, but then the community that they were surrounded with. So we're actually making society more unsafe with that attitude. And that's what I just bring out to people, that if you become a victim and don't get the justice, and then you turn around and become the criminal, how are we're just working on ways that other folks who have been caught and who have
Another question? Oh, Simone.
Or you mentioned earlier that the current capital punishment system is a direct, descendant is a way to phrase it, of lynching. And so I think this connection with the criminal justice system and history is very important. Maybe the best way to, present that history to people, because I think a lot of people don't understand how all these things are connected, or they go back to chattel slavery. And I think that understanding would be really helpful as to why we're seeing so many Black people incarcerated.
Yeah, I think that's an amazing question, and I wish I had a good answer to it. I was just reading a book by Clint Smith called How the Word is Passed. Has anyone else read that? It's amazing. I highly recommend it. But Clint Smith is a poet and a writer, and has a PhD in education from Harvard. He traveled to sites of slavery throughout the United States and really looked at and examined how is slavery remembered in these institutions. And what's really interesting is he went to some places, Monticello, for example, where the way slavery was remembered 15, 20 years ago, even 5 years ago, was dramatically different than the way that these places are recognizing slavery today. And in some places, it was basically not even talked about. So people would go to plantations and get tours on the excellence of the architecture, and no one would talk about the fact that these buildings were built by the hands of people who had been enslaved. And there was no part of these tours that was talking about the experiences, the daily experiences, lived experiences of people who are enslaved in these locations. So I think that there is tremendously deep thinking about these, about how we remember and document our history. And I think what really worries me is I feel that as an entire society, we're systematically undereducated in the role of slavery in our nation across all aspects of who we are as a country. And I think that we have a huge reckoning that we need to be going through as a nation. You know, and to the question that you had about people, you know, the question that people can say, well, you know, they committed the crime, they deserve the death penalty, they deserve the sentence. You know, I think when we think about crime and violence in our society, we cannot forget that the society that we have is profoundly economically unequal. It's racially unequal. And that is manifesting in our criminal justice system today. And our criminal justice system is not the right solution for where we need to go. And so when we look at punishment, I think we have to really deeply think about that. And we also need to think about the severity of the kinds of ways that we're addressing crime and violence in our societies. If someone's locked away for 70 years for stealing a tuna fish sandwich from a Whole Foods, which has happened, someone is serving that sentence today. His name is Larry Dayries. He's going to die in prison for stealing a sandwich from a Whole Foods. You know, you need to say what's happening there. That's not preserving public safety. That's not a proportionate answer to the harm that occurred in the situation. You know, the vast majority of people in prison, you know, even if someone somewhere thought that there was a public safety reason that incarceration was the answer in that case, and I'm not saying that I'm the person who would say that, but even if someone did, people age out of that and can be safe and can safely go home, and you know, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100-year sentences don't answer that. Executing someone who's mentally ill is not a public safety answer. And so we need to think about all of these things together.
Other comments or other questions? Yes.
More of a personal question. So I know the work that you guys do isn't for everyone. It's more of a calling, right? So what would some advice be to people, maybe undergrads or law students, who are looking to get into the work that you guys do? Some piece of advice to encourage them.
Drew, why don't you begin? You think you want to be a tax lawyer, then you realize there's a whole other world out there.
Yeah, I mean, you know, get involved, right? I mean, we look at these organizations, we're all pretty community open, and so volunteering, we've got a volunteer program called the Adelphoi program. We're actually paired to be a relational brother-sister. You know, that's kind of our answer to step up and do something now. Obviously, a slower, longer, lighter touch would be reading the New Jim Crow. We have required readings, the New Jim Crow, Just Mercy, and Rethinking Incarceration, plus the one that was already recommended, those kind of things.
Yeah, I was gonna say that I always tell people that it's everybody got a role to play. It may not be the attorney role, it may not be the social worker role, but the myths that we're trying to dispel are something that we encounter at our Thanksgiving dinners. There's something we encounter at campus, in the cafeteria. Every day we have a moment, we have a second, some time to fight against this injustice and create equity in different situations. And so I think it's just us seeking out those and then being bold enough to approach them when they come our way. And then like Drew said, you got reading, voting, but I also encourage folks that, like, let's say you want to go to school and be a dentist. There are folks in our community, you know, right here in this area who are experiencing incarceration, and it doesn't take, you don't have to have a job to have a relationship with a Black person experiencing incarceration. You can become friends with somebody who's experiencing it, and that alone will have an effect on the way you view the system and are able to explain it to others in your community on how it's impacting folks. So I challenge you all to find someone and become a friend, and it doesn't mean you're here and they're there and you're trying to get them, you're trying to get to understanding what that lifestyle is about. And so So I would say we all have a role. It just varies on how much we do.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I actually found what you said interesting.
So a little bit louder.
Oh, yes. I personally found what you stated interesting about the disproportionate punishments for something as simple as a sandwich. And even now, I've witnessed it currently. In cases of rape, the person's typically out on parole not long afterwards. However, in the cases of substance, whether it's that it was found with them or possession or so on, the punishment is that much more severe. And for me, I interpret inequity beginning as constitutional amendments were made to benefit specifically African American individuals, women suffrage, and so on, in order to fill that disproportionate gap. So provided as such, are we able to mitigate these punishments or the legality on the legal level of these punishments and how that process is executed on the federal or even the level of the localities in form of legislation? Mitigation in the form of legislation, are we able to do that in a criminal justice system where the focus is now more on the supposed crime or the situation itself rather than the individual and placing that individual into context, as we prefer to do when we're analyzing something before we pass judgment?
Yeah, I think I think that legislative reform of all kinds is really important. And so we can talk about kind of the individual case level, but we also really need to think about, as you're pointing to, systemic reforms that can protect everyone. And so those can look like reforms that protect people who have certain conditions from certain extreme punishments, mental illness, intellectual disability. The legislature is debating these kinds of bills as we speak to protect people with these conditions from the death penalty. It can look like other kinds of reforms that actually provide second chances for people who are incarcerated. And so something that we haven't, is kind of outside the topic of this panel is, we have so many people who are in prison with really long sentences for whom their presence there isn't serving a public safety purpose. And we need mechanisms for those people to be able to go home, and those mechanisms don't exist. And so that is a legislative solution that can serve everyone. There's always going to be differences in how people are sentenced because judges are different, because people who walk into courtrooms have different life experiences, and so that's never, a completely uniform phenomenon. But we need sentencing practices that aren't so extreme, sentencing ranges that aren't so extreme. We need judges to have the possibility to give mercy in cases where that might not be allowed.
Really quickly, I'll just mention too that we had this day at Restoring Justice when I was a couple weeks ago, where we were talking about this article that was written about Megan Stallion and Tory Lanez, and it talked about, the point of the article was basically that our system does not allow that flexibility in dealing with different cases, like a tuna sandwich and a rape. Like it's like this is the blanket thing, the judge gets to decide, but there's no flexibility on how we address the issue individually. And we can do that. We're spending all this doggone money, incarcerating folks and paying prosecutors and paying the system, but if we took that money and reinvested it in approaches that would address the issue, the real issues, individualized, then I think we would all feel a whole lot better about this. And so, just to throw that up here.
Ada.
I'm Ms. Butler. So I kind of had a question for just the organization as a whole. I found the statement that oftentimes the prosecution is worried about winning or creating an image that they're tough on crime rather than actually helping the victim's family, whereas your organization is trying to truly find that middle point. So I was wondering if and how you do reach out to victim families, and if there ever is friction between their goals and those of your organization.
Absolutely, that is an excellent question, and it's complicated and a lot to unpack. So first, I would say, just in the realm of the death penalty, there are cases where victims' families do want the death penalty, and the state pursues the death penalty. And there are cases where the victim's family does not want the death penalty, and the state still pushes the death penalty. And that happens all the time. One example was Melissa Lucio, who you may have heard of her case. She had some really major issues about being wrongfully convicted and being actually innocent. The victim was a member of her family. Her family did not want her execution. But this is really common. Someone was executed last year. The family was Catholic. They had forgiven the person who was going to be executed, and he was executed anyway over their protests. And so you really see how survivors of violence, victims of violence are being weaponized in the system and not necessarily universally served by the prosecution. Our approach in our office, and this is pretty common for people who do work at the stage we are at, we as an office would not reach out to a victim's family directly. And that's because they're experiencing severe trauma and loss, and it's not our role to do something that would cause them further harm and pain. But sometimes we partner with groups that are specifically, their work is to speak with victims and try to find restorative ways to solve cases. But they're not, we reach out to these groups. If they feel like it's an appropriate case, they may get involved. They may themselves approach the victim's family, but we would never do that ourselves. And when these groups do it, they do it with their own integrity. Their goals aren't the same as the defense counsel, because our role as defense counsel is to advocate for our client. And I want to be 100% clear on that. Like, that's our job when we walk into that courtroom. And so we want to be respectful of those differences.
Drew, how would you answer that?
Yeah, I think the restorative practices are the answer, right? Turn it from punitive to restorative. A couple anecdotes is, I was actually kind of surprised over the last year and a half. We had a few clients that became direct crime victims themselves while we were representing them and going to the prosecution and saying, look, you got to decide. Are you trying to prosecute this person, or are you trying to give them services? And the rejection of services and care, really harming a victim of a crime because they had other pending cases. So we also, on the trial level, it's a part of our duty to investigate the case and reach out to the victim. We always honor, the alleged victim, because our clients have not been, proven to be guilty of anything. And so when we do that, we're always very respectful, obviously, on trauma and harm. But it is shocking to me at how many times, the victim has been completely ignored by the police and completely ignored by the prosecutor, and they're just thankful to have someone to talk to on, asserting what they want. And we're able to provide, counsel if they need that or whatever. So we do lean into that a bit. I do kind of want to add, this is not an answer to the question, but if you really took the true victim crimes and put them in a box where there's the crimes that a victim was harmed and wants to pursue prosecution. If we don't focus on just that in the conversation about the whole system, you talk about drug crimes where there are no victims. This morning I was on a case, felon possession of a weapon. There's no victim, but the prosecutor still, beating his chest, wanting to win. And you really minimize, that conversation is really only talking about a small minority of what's causing mass incarceration. And so if the system really took care of the low-hanging fruit and did not incarcerate people for tuna sandwiches or, health issues like drug addictions, then, it'd be a lot easier to be able to have a restorative answer to that question.
Thank you.
Professor Velko, do we have time for?
Yeah, we have time for more questions.
Go ahead.
So I'm taking a punishment class right now, and we just finished talking about how a paper where I'm not sure exactly his role, but he was kind of talking about Gideon and the effect that it had on just our criminal justice system, and you kind of touched on it as well. And in class and in the paper, he discusses how discussing rights and ensuring rights really can be detrimental for the rights themselves and the victims themselves and the defendants as well. So for Gideon, the one he was focusing on, he was talking about how Gideon served a role to essentially empower the prosecutors and maintain the status quo, despite it allegedly like giving everyone like an equal claim with like different, just by providing them a defendant. But I guess I was just kind of wondering, y'all seem to be working on an individual level as well, and like looking at each case and trying to work against that and provide the services that are necessary, not just like the bare minimum, but like how do you balance like defending rights and valuing that without taking away from the actual experiences themselves? You want to uphold like the human element within each person without abstracting too much, but I don't know. I was kind of wondering if y'all could speak to that, your experiences.
Yeah, quickly, my answer is just that kind of what I said before. I'm like, really the ideals written into the Constitution, 40% of Bill of Rights protects the accused. Those ideals have just never been met. And so when you honor that humanity, you are honoring those. And so each step towards that, but just recognizing that there's such a far gap that like, yeah, if you're allowed to piecemeal it and not actually honor it the full way, like give a blow-up doll attorney to people as the honoring rights, then yeah, it is going to just cause them to be able to skirt it. But it's just honoring that gold standard, I guess, and that's why we work so hard to build it.
So it sounds like you either might be in law school or are thinking of law school, and so, for those of you who are, lots of different kinds of law you can do. You can do trial level work. We do some pre-trial work and then a good deal of post-conviction work, appellate work, which is a different style of work. It's after someone has been sentenced. It's a lot of brief writing, a lot of storytelling. And so what you're saying kind of reminds me of a conversation I had with someone who was younger in our office the other day. When we're dealing with a post-conviction posture in a case, we're often dealing with very, very complicated statutes that require extremely complex analysis and briefing because we need to be explaining to the court, this is why you are allowed to procedurally address this issue that was never raised in trial because the trial counsel was terrible. And the court needs, quote, a procedural reason to do that. And so, we could spend 50 pages of briefing explaining why that's the case. And I was talking with someone and he said, well, shouldn't we put the client's story, which is itself, probably 100 pages about what the client experienced in their childhood, should we put the client's page, after the procedural stuff so that, because the court first needs to decide whether procedurally they can listen to that story and give relief based on that story. And I said, no, we always put the story first. Judges are human beings and they need to know the human story. The other thing that paper reminds me of is something that was talked about when I was in law school by criminal law professors, which is the criminal law system has a lot of procedural rights. So that means rights to process, rights to have a hearing here, rights to have a hearing there, rights to have someone listen to your legal claim. But those are different than fundamental human rights. And I think that you can have a bunch of procedural rights that don't actually protect human beings because you can have a bunch of procedure and at the end of the day you might end up with the same sentence. And so that's something we see all the time and is a very problematic dynamic in criminal law.
Anything, Monique or Drew, that you want to say before we conclude?
No, just a challenge to get connected to someone who's experiencing incarceration or who has in the past. And
What if you don't know how to do that?
Texas Advocates for Justice is a great source. Pure Justice, Texas Organizing Project, Restoring Justice. But there's a number of ways that you can get involved locally, and they have virtual options too. You could even do court watch, y'all. Just go downtown one day and go to the criminal courthouse and go into one of them courtrooms and sit down and watch for a couple of hours in the morning. And you will be disgusted. You think you don't want to do that work? You're going to be ready to do the work after you see that stuff. So that's another one, but that's all I have.
Oh, Monique, we got to keep in touch with you.
And you can come with us. We go. So you can shadow us. We do intern for a day. One thing I will add as you think about this, if that's not your jam and you as just a member of society and policing affects us all. And so really, I think one simple thing is changing the mindset at times of like, if there is something going on in front of you that's just a product of poverty, not defaulting to fear and calling the police and trying to think outside the box of like, maybe there's some alternatives that will lead to wholeness and safety instead.
So round of applause for our principal.